Working Cows Podcast, episode 328. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. Very excited to be joined today by Kent Donica. Kent is a stocker operator from Oklahoma, and we're going to talk to him today about some of his perspective, how it has evolved, how it's changed, and what stayed the same about his perspective on the stocker operation business. And very excited to have this conversation with, again, one of the instructors and educators there at Understanding Ag. So really looking forward to this conversation. Kent, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
I'm excited to be here, buddy.
Yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit about your operation, what you have going on there, kind of what's been the basis of your operation over the years.
So pretty much what brought me to the dance is a peewee. And when I say peewee, I know late in the 2000s, I said something. I told him I had a live weight, yeah, and he said, "Well, like weighing 3.5 or 4." And I said, "No, the last time I bought 1,000 head, I didn't have 250,000 pounds." My kids and I raised 4 kids, and they'll tell you it was like, "Oh wow, these are big ones. They weigh 3." It was a semi. I'll be nice. It was a neglected 200 to 250 pounder. Mostly out of southern Louisiana from 3 sale barns. I got hooked up with a guy. He did a good job. And I pretty much was in the market at least 10 months out of the year. I tried to buy and sell a load a month at least. I usually sat out October, which I've described as National Dead Calf Month for about 30 years because it just wasn't worth it. And sometimes I let the greed get the better of my good sense and got in, and I was kind of just flipping a coin. When my kids were growing up, they told me, "It's like, Dad, we need to quit this. It's not fun." And I said, it was October. And I've said for years, Clay, that the only reason most people buy cattle in October is it's 11 months from the end of it to the beginning of it. And they only have a 6-month memory, and they just forget what happened. They can't remember that long.
So I live not as close to Deadwood, South Dakota as I used to, but I used to live within 30 minutes of Deadwood, South Dakota. And so it's a good place to go get a decent steak at a reasonable price. And you can talk about the morality of the rest of the town if you want, but it is a good place to go to get a decent steak at a reasonable price, if nothing else. But what we call Halloween night in Deadwood is rookie night. It's when everybody who's never been out on a town very much in their life goes out on the town, and then they get themselves in trouble. And it sounds maybe kind of like that's somewhat of the experience also with dealing with October calves, buying calves in October. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and a lot of people, and I've worked it. I guess I haven't since 2015, but from about 95 to 2015, a little longer, I worked at least one sale barn, mostly sorting cattle, running parts of several of them. But kind of my gig was if the sorting crew got behind, there I came.
Sure.
And so a lot of these guys, they'd be griping. They're like, "Man, these calves are dying. These farmers they won't do nothing." And I would tell them, "Look, somebody got to hold a gun on you and they're thumbing that card, making you pay that for them." Tell them, "This is the same thing you said last October." Ta-da! And most of them did not like the ta-da, Clay.
Yeah.
Anyway, my kid one time I said, "You know what? I'll make you a deal. We'll quit and see how it goes." And they said, "Dad, you're afraid you'll forget." So the next time, and my kids had a lot of authority at a very young age, and they were good hands. That's when I kind of started scaling back when they started leaving to go to college, and I realized that I couldn't replace them.
Mm.
And it's not that I hired bad people. They just either they didn't suit me or I didn't suit them. And there was a lot of both of that, or they just didn't know quite as much as they let on or thought they did.
Sure.
Anyway, they have there's a box of those orange paint sticks. And my snake coming in my shoes about 40 feet long. And they kept enough, wrote up there, no cattle in October for a year. It was still on there the next year, so I couldn't forget. And they told me a deal's a deal, and we quit.
Is it something that stockmanship can overcome, or do you think that it's just the way that those cattle get handled a lot of times, where they're weaned on the truck and sent on a long bus ride somewhere, and just makes them really hard to deal with, as far as keeping them alive once you get them?
I think probably good stockmanship is probably, with regards to animal health, is probably the most underrated or least thought through thing on the planet. And and everybody, I'm sure everybody tell you, and I will too, I'm a pretty good stockman. About 15 years ago, I became a student of Tom Knopfsinger. And it wasn't a real good first meeting, because it started with, I told him, I think you're a hippie in a cowboy hat. And he still hasn't let me forget it, and probably won't. When I die and go to heaven, if I outlive Tom, he's going to say, oh, yeah. And he got pretty abrupt, and he said, you go home and try this. And he goes in, when it works, if you're man enough, call me and apologize. I went home and tried it, and I'm like, I'm going to have to call that old guy and apologize. This is awful. And I did. And we've been good friends ever since. But I think a lot of the problem is just the aggregation of very small negatives.
Mm.
The weather's changing. You stick them on the truck, haul them to town. And I worked at one. They put kids on my shoes' feet to some degree. And, but most of the people I've ever met at a livestock auction, they need a lesson in stockmanship. And they get a little bit of a pass, because I can't remember where I heard this term, but I realize you got to move at the speed of commerce. But that being allowed for, there's a lot more negative than positive.
Yep. One of my favorite stockmanship insights came early on in the History of the Working Cows podcast, when Kurt Pate said, as our facilities have improved, our stockmanship has decreased. And you think about the amount of pipe. You think about the amount of pipe, the miles and miles of pipe that have gone into the average sale barn in the last 20 years. And you don't have to worry about them blowing through the wood, the wood-sided pens anymore or anything like that. You can just push on them as hard as you want. That pipe is not going anywhere. And so I think that's part of what you're talking about.
I got a college, Stillwater in 87. I was a grain buyer at a feed mill for a couple of 3 years, and didn't much care for being inside, but I learned a lot about feed. I learned a lot about, I was housed in the same office as our nutritionist. He'd come up under old man Hitch, the old man lad, and a couple of really good, he said, the best technical and the best practical nutritionists. And I learned a lot from Clay Williams, learned a lot about the board and how to price stuff and how the futures market worked. And when I thought I knew it all, I got out of Dodge and worked for a guy a couple of years, and his kids started coming back home. So I just struck out on my own.
Yep. No, I think that there's a lot of room for improvement there. But I guess what I would like to talk about a little bit is kind of how you think about the stocker business and how you approach it, and maybe how your approach and your philosophy differs from others that are doing the similar work.
Mine probably, and I grew up on a cow calf operation, and early and then later a registered operation in Southeast Oklahoma. And my dad and my uncle were both extremely nervous till the day they both died about me running stockers, because they saw guys, it was kind of boom or bust, right? You make money a while. And so I didn't have I didn't have any preconceived notions about it, about, you buy this calf and make it. And so I kind of early on approached it from, okay, if I'm in this to make money, when do I have the most money made? And when I kind of got started, the peanut program was pretty big here at Ardmore. I'm about 2 hours south of Oklahoma City now, and nobody knew what a cover crop was then, but they'd sling some cereal rye or some wheat, and if you were willing to take care of me, that stuff cheap. And I realized pretty early on, I guess a lot of it would be considered sell by marketing. Now it was like, I've got some money. If I got some money made in these, what I never did was let my forage availability dictate my marketing. I would sometimes, but if I had a good money made in a calf and I had wheat and ryegrass halfway to my knees and black green with nitrogen fertilizer, it didn't bother me a bit to sell him, go buy another one and put on it.
And I think that becomes important from a turnover perspective, right? Just increasing turnover, making those trades more often rather than just, hey, we've still got grass here, we don't need to send these yet. But it gives you an opportunity to make that same profitable turn
a lot
again.
of people in my business, their marketing plan is we'll sell them the first sale after we realize we're out of grass. And that sounds ludicrous, but I mean, early on, I realized I was buying a calf weighing 2.5, and I was keeping him a year and trying to make him weigh 8. And I realized if he made $100 when he weighed 8, I had 90 of it made when he weighed 6, maybe 100.
Right.
And I mean, if you're not afraid to turn around and buy something else, and there was some times when I did that the best trade, the best trade looking at me was the one I already had. That is, it would have paid me to just keep my own cattle.
Right.
But by and large, as long as you're engaged, I think the term in Wall Street is arbitrage, selling what's overvalued and buying what's undervalued.
And I have been asked to speak some more here and there over the years, and one of the talks I haven't quite fleshed out yet, but I've been thinking about is the most important words in ranching. And one of the most important words in ranching, for example, would be like overgrazing and undergrazing in the same pasture. But another one of the most important words in ranching would be value of gain. How much did I get paid to put the next pound on them? Because I already would have gotten paid, these numbers are way outdated today, but today's a little bit crazy. So I already would have got paid $950 for this 600-pound calf. How much more will I get paid if he weighs, 650 or 7? And we can't apply the dollars per pound for every pound after that, because I already had that money in my pocket when he weighed 600. And so I think that's something that we have to continually renew our mind about the way we think about those things.
I'm not going to say it's simple arithmetic because I'm pretty good with numbers, but it's not complicated arithmetic. And a lot of people don't do it. And I've showed people that, and that fallacy, man, there's a lot I got a lot of big buttons, and it's pretty easy to push them. And one of them is, well, the bigger the calf, the bigger the check. Well, yeah, but that is not the same as more profit. If it costs you $90 to put that next 100 pounds on and you get paid 80 for it, you have just lost $10 a head. And most people don't realize it because they don't see the $90.
You mentioned undervalued animals. How do you go about identifying undervalued animals?
A lot of times, it's visual. I mean, you get a little thin calf, just kind of something somebody doesn't want. I guess maybe the biggest glaring undervalued animal I see is about a 650-pound bull. I've had a lot of people pay me $100, $125 to cut their bulls. And I mean, that's just it. Or, something maybe, these numbers are probably going to be way behind too, maybe. And early on, I realized, okay, I've got to be careful who I let buy these, because a lot of order buyers, and rightfully so, because people tell them this is what I want. I told a guy, let's buy me a 300-pound heifer. Well, a 300-pound heifer was costing $130. That's, call it $400. So I go down there I go to the sale to pick some up, and this guy was a good guy and honest. But I'm sitting there and I realize a 350-pound heifer costs $410. prorated to 100 pounds, it's costing me $20. And at the time I figured it was costing me 80 to put it on. I'm like, well, why don't you buy me those? What about those threes? Because that was just kind of the whole. Everybody wants this and nobody wants this. They get a little bigger. Oh yeah, they'll fit 2 orders. And he looked at me and he goes, we're buying a 300-pound heifer. They weigh 350.
So I mean, does it require you to be there, or do you just have to, like you said, find the right guy who can see those holes as well?
If you don't, you better have the right guy. And I've kind of, we're at Understanding Ag, we're working on a kind of a budgeting and finance and marketing school. And I've got several slides. I mean, most of our success is a function of our relationships. I mean, it's who you know and who knows you. And I know this guy's not going to trade on his orders. He's going to be honest. And he knows me enough to know that he's not going to call up and get his butt chewed out because they unloaded a ground load of cattle at my place and it looks like the last jackpot at the local sale barn. And if there's a clown in there, maybe that clown may make the most money of all of them.
Do you end up getting a lot of singles, a lot of smaller lots, or do you end up, I mean, I know you're bringing in loads at a time, but are they put together in smaller lots generally, or do you?
Actually, most of my career, it's very rare that I ever bought a load. Most of that deal out of Louisiana, and that deal was from 96 to 09 or 10. I had the back of a spread axle pot that was going to Woodward, Oklahoma every Thursday. And if I bought 10 600-pound bulls that went in there, that's it. And if I put 25 peewees, that was it. And, and that was a lot of it, but that's, you were talking about the holes. Maybe, there's not enough to get a load. There's not enough to mess with. Everybody, February, everybody's hunting a 6-weight graze out calf. Well, nobody wants a 3-weight, but you can still make him. He's not a graze out wheat calf, but stick him on graze out wheat and he'll work pretty good against the August board. And so a lot of that too. I mean, but a lot of it was, you buy 25 head a week for 50 weeks out of the year. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, we've used 1,200 tags this year. We got to order tags. And I never worried too much about, making them fit when they come, because if one of them got bigger, I'd move him up. And if they were smaller and it wasn't a reason that got him kicked off, I'd move them back. And that deal worked really good. But, the few times I have bought, good straight load, I mean, I bought a ground load off the ranch one time. These things look like English peas when they came off, and when I sent them to Oklahoma City, they cut them 3 ways. I mean, I tell the guys I buy for, you only need 3 to sell a group on Monday at Oklahoma City, and there's probably way more of them get sold one at a time than in groups. And yeah, it creates some problems. I mean,
yep. Do you think that people are kept from employing this strategy because of pride on some level? Like they don't want to be the guy buying, the back end of a spread axle coming every week? Or do you think that plays any role in it at all? Absolutely.
Ego's the only way to say it, and I had a neighbor that one time we had I don't know, dogs out after I don't know what anyway. I had 300 or 400 head on wheat, and I had 2 other neighbors that had way more than me. And I went up there to check my calves, and my pasture's completely empty except for 3 of Dylan's. And Dylan's pasture was completely empty, and we found him running up and down the Washita River. So we just go to sorting, and Dylan's son was helping us. He kind of rode past. And he goes, "Man, it's pretty easy to pick Kent's out because they both ran a pretty good one." And I'm like, "Man, that hurts. That hurts, buddy." And he goes, "Man, I got to call a spade, Mr. Kent." And I'm like, "Yeah, you see a plain one, just
don't have to look at the ear tag color, just turn it in."
Yeah, if he's 2 colors and quarter Brahma, he goes in Kent's pen.
Yeah, for sure.
Bob Custer, I worked for Bob at his sale barn here for 20 years, and ripped there one time, and he told me, he said, "Man," and I'm pretty famous for getting cattle pretty fleshy. I don't sell a thin one. And I think that's good management. Now, that being said, I overdid it from time to time when corn was $2.50 a bushel. It's a lot harder to get them too fat now, Clay. Anyway, Bob told me, he goes, man, why don't you send me a load of good thin black ones? And I said, Bob, I don't need your help selling a good thin black one. You get paid to sell these fat plain ones. I said, get after it. And we mumbled around. I'm like, earn your money, old man.
Very good. So is the marketing similar to the buying then, as far as you buy where there's a hole in the market and then you try to sell into where the demand is when it comes?
Absolutely. In spring, so kind of I'm going to say the high of the 6-weight calf, 1st of April. Sometime March and April, the graze out wheat guys want him, boys in the Flint Hills want him. And if they get over 600 pounds, that man, you can stick them in the feed yard against that auged board and everybody just loses their mind. So when you get a market like that, and I'm not saying I'll handle some good cattle, but the value of gain against on one just a little off is usually a lot more. If you can swallow your pride and stand for somebody driving there saying, who bought that crap? But when cattle get high or they're in high demand, that spread between a 1.5 and a 1, I don't know if you looked at the market. I mean, it vanished. Now you try to sell a plain, pretty fat one in October, weighing 5 to go to wheat, and everybody's got all of the fat 5 weights they want to see. Then you're going to get dinged pretty good. But it's like I told a guy that did work for me. I said, he's like, man, you sold those cattle. He said, they're $75 back of a good one. I said, I know. But I said, I bought them 125 back. Mm-hmm. I don't care till it gets over 125. Mm-hmm. And then about relationships. I've sold lots of guys cattle and either at the stockyards or in the country, and they tell you, man, won't you get a good one? But it's about the relationship. I mean, my good friend Jeffrey Reuter from Kingfisher called me one day, and I said, yeah, I'd sent some cattle up there, and I guess he'd talked to Custer, and I said, yeah, they're straight. And Jeffrey knew that they were straight. And he had a neighbor that was 70 years old that had some wheat, and he bought 2 loads of my cattle in the ring in Oklahoma City, put them on a ground load, dumped them out in the county road in that guy's gate, and they never had a problem. Because Jeffrey knew that if I said they're straight, I hadn't went to the sale and bought 10 or 12 on a 2-load deal that were balling calves and balled them out and stuck them on the deal. And I'm not saying there's not honest people, but I am saying there's probably no shortage of people anywhere, and certainly at a sale barn, that might not tell the truth for money.
So we talked about the fact that you're usually, you rarely have ever bought a full load. It's oftentimes the back of a spread axle, 20 peewees, 6, or 10 600 pounders or whatever. Let's talk about the marketing side of that. Do they frequently leave your place as a load lot then?
Back in those days, and I don't handle near the cattle I used to, because the last of my help with the last name Donica left in 2015. And I had a lot of lease country that the leases were getting high enough and I was getting spread out enough. But in those days, I mean, it was easy because I had enough numbers. But even now, it's, I rarely don't. I'll sell a pot, and I usually send them to the city because, I know those guys. And if I call them, tell them, look, there's probably 3 cuts here. Well, if you got 3 cuts, tell them they're going to be in the city, They may call somebody they know and say, hey, let them make sure those Donica cattle don't bring any less than this. So no, but, I can kind of sort them. I mean, if I put 40 head on a ground load, split a pot with one of my neighbors, I may have 2 15-head deals and a 10-head deal. And the guys up there, they don't mind that. Obviously, would they like 200 head of cattle, 3 rings full on the same scale ticket? Sure. Right.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that was part of the strategy with undervalued animals, is to find them and group them and then sell them as a load.
And if I was, I'd probably handle now I don't know, 500-600 head a year. If I doubled that, it would probably make me money, because you get a low, and this is what I've told multiple people, and I'm going to cover it in this marketing class I was talking about. The minimum units is a load, a pot. I mean, most guys, if you call them up and you tell them you got 35,000 pounds, they're going to say in some various form, that is what a livestock auction is for. Good luck. Mm-hmm. And I understand that. And it's kind of like some years back, I was working for a guy, and it was cold, it was rainy, kind of drizzled a while, then it sleet a while, and we were loading about 400 head of really good 9-weight black steers. And this guy showed up and looked at me, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I kind of got a regular job. I'm going to try and see if I can keep it a little while." And he's standing there hunched up, and he looked at me, and he goes, you can't tell sitting here, but I'm about 6'6", about 230. He goes, and I said, "I'm not getting off my horse because my saddle gets wet. I'm going to get cold." And he stood there a minute, and he goes, "Man, this is terrible." Look at me. He goes, "Are those cattle all straight? Is there any cheaters?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Load them on the truck." He goes and gets in his truck and leaves. And the guy there on the cattle's like, he didn't even look at him. And I said, "Yeah, but when he said, 'Are there any cheaters?' I knew what he meant, and he knew that I meant it. And if I see a cheater, we're going to cut him off." That kind of gets back to the relay. That guy still he's like, "Yeah, you can't help." He goes, "And guys just pull up, look over the fence, and then they leave." And I'm like, "Well, there's guys that wouldn't do that." But I said, "You got to understand, too, I've sorted probably 250,000 head the last 10 years that guy looked at." Mm. And I said, "We have a relationship that supersedes that pen of cattle."
Right. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Well, yeah, it would be a lot easier and probably make me some money, Clay. But quite frankly, I'm not lazy, but I don't want to work like I did 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Guy told me about 25, 30 years ago, he said, "Someday you don't really care if you get on a horse or not." And I looked at him and I said, "Yeah, right. It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I don't think I've been on a horse in 4 months." And I'm quite happy with it.
Yeah, for sure. So how do you address, or how have you addressed health issues? How do you keep them healthy? Talk to me about some of those things.
Okay, this is where we may get out. You may say, "You know what, Kent, have a good day," and hit the button. And if you do, that's okay. So I'm not a big fan of work them off the truck, processing on arrival. I'm a pretty big fan, to quote Tom Nonsinger, "Just give them a minute." One of the sale barns I worked for, the guy's got his son owned part of it. He'd been a practicing veterinarian, but Mark and his dad handled 15,000, 20,000 a year. And this is in the mid 90s. And they gave him a Micatil and a blackleg and an Ivomec. And of course, at the time, I'm like, what have you lost your mind? And he told me then, he said, "There's enough cortisol and adrenaline running through their system." He said, "They don't have an immune system for 2 to 3 weeks." And he told me then, he said, "You understand," he said, "you should be smart enough. Sticking that needle in them does not confer immunity. You have to have a response." And I think we've all forgot that, number one. And number two, every label you read on any medicine will say, "This works with blah, blah, blah for in use of healthy cattle." Well, by definition, I'm probably not buying a healthy one. And all of us are buying a highly stressed. Their social structure's been thrown away. They're dehydrated. They're hungry. Probably had somebody chasing them around with a yellow hot shot ad nauseum. So I'll just let them sit. I'm a pretty good mostly self-taught student of nutrition. And that's the big mistake I see with little cattle. I mean, most people try to treat them like a mini 5-weight. Most of the cattle I get in will eat better hay than your $20,000 roping horse. And you can ask any of my 4 kids, God help you if I walk past the water trough and I couldn't see the bottom. Because if it got dirty enough to see the bottom and somebody didn't clean it, we're going to all be out there in the dark cleaning the water troughs for practice. I mean, and again, like I said, the aggregation of small negatives, I think it's, the aggregation of positive. Leave them alone. Every calf I buy is going to drink corded in their in clean water for 5 days. I think internal parasites, and particularly coccidiosis, I've had people say, man, these calves are doing terrible. You come look at them, you walk out there, and there's bloody stool everywhere. They've got blood under their tail, and you tell them, man, what are you doing for coccidiosis? Oh, it's usually not a problem for us. I'm like, no, the problem is your lack of observational skills.
Yeah, I don't know about usually, but it is right now.
Yep. Today's the day. And, well, I'll just tell you, you have the ability to edit. It was made very clear to me by my bosses that under no circumstance were they give me a hot live mic, and that's probably good on their part. But, a lot of, I think cattle and jig stockers in general, and the smaller you get, the more this is. I've told people a 200-pound calf is like a bunch of shots of tequila lined up down the bar. You get one or two, and you're like, man, this pretty good. But by the time you get too many, it is too late.
Yep.
You're going to, and I subscribe pretty strongly. You tell people, look, if you can handle 100, stick with 100. And over the last 20 years, everybody's like kind of get big or go home and get bigger or go home. And I can remember about 07 or 08, I was talking with a friend of mine, and he's like, man, we need to go to handling 4,000 or 5,000 instead of 1,500. And I said, I don't have everything paid. I'm not going to do it. And I didn't. I sat down and told my wife, and I either got to go back to 700 or 800, or we got to quadruple in size. But I think, a lot of our wounds are self-inflicted. Well, I think most of them are, and it's kind of trying to, what I call keep your monster in the cage, your fixed costs, your overheads. I mean, I've got to have 200, 300 a month. I've got to have this many. Well, when you walk out there and your help's just about to rebel, and most of my good help call me dad, and they're like, Dad, man, you better slow down because we're getting tired of this. And guy sent me a thing one time. He said, this reminds me of going to your place to help. And it said, some parents run a tight ship. I run a pirate ship. There's drinking, swearing, and the occasional mutiny from the crew I created. My kids didn't drink a lot when they were growing up, but I mean, they had enough autonomy, and I think it's smart enough. It's like, okay, maybe I'm going to listen to you. I'd tell them I think that's stupid. I think it's wrong, but we're going to do it. Well, sometimes it didn't. And,
right.
But anyway, I got off the subject, but number one, don't let your reach exceed your grasp. And that's kind of a lot easier, I don't, it's kind of hard to get me excited fooling one if I'm not going to make at least 100 or think I can. And I know people trying to handle 5,000 head and make $40 a head.
Right. Yep. That's what I was going to say is if you might have to go to 5,000 head if you're only making a small profit on each one. But if you can figure out a way to make a bigger profit on each one, you don't have to turn over as many. And
I learned pretty early on to recognize that and just say, look, we're going to skip a week. We're going to skip a week before we get hemmed up in the corner and get the wind knocked out of us. Didn't happen a lot, but it's kind of like, and then after two of my kids left, I told the other two, I said, we are going to do what we can do. I'm going to keep 400 head in these pens and 400 or 500 outside cattle. That I apologize. I'd stop. We can't, three of us can't do what five of us used to.
So you said early on there that you subscribe heavily to the Tom Knopfsinger, give them a minute. And part of giving them a minute is giving them a minute to acclimate to their surroundings, but also get all the adrenaline out of their system. And then whatever medical or vaccine interventions you do have will be more effective. Is that part of what you're thinking?
So I get a calf in. I think from an immune system standpoint, I'm going to get rid of these internal parasites. I'm going to worm him. I like a product called Enforce. It's a nasal. Put it up their nose because it requires very little active immune response. People will tell you, yeah, it only lasts 2 or 3 months. I'm like, dude, the fight's over in 3 or 4. I don't care if it wears off in 2 months. If he's not straight in 2 months, he's not going to get straight. and then I'll give them a pastorella. And I use pre-spons, I guess, out of force of habit. I've got friends that use one shot because the pastorella, that's the biggest boogeyman I've got. I've seen IBR go through cattle, you know, they runny eyed, weepy eyed, their nose run, you know, obviously like your kids with the flu, but most of the time it won't kill them. They may look, you may think, oh my, I'm going to lose every one of these. And in 3 or 4 days, it'll go through them. And part of the reason I kind of went to a delayed processing, Clay, is, you know, I think the odds of any calf going through a livestock auction and not getting exposed to most of the pathogens that we vaccinate is single digit at biggest and probably 0. They've got it in their system. You don't need to stick it in there and add more stress on an already stressed system. So that's all I do. I don't do any blood work. I'll put a tag in their ear, and then I'll come back at about day 30, cut the bulls, tip horns, and I will give them another IBR injectable. And the sole reason I do that is so I can tell people they've had 2 rounds of IBR.
Sure.
Now, I'm counting one of them as the enforced, but they had, and if that's important to them, I have an obligation. I'm going to stick them so they can say in the ring they've been double vaccinated.
And then the stockmanship, from a stockmanship perspective, that's part of the continuing health strategy too, I would imagine, is continuing to make sure that they remain as stress-free as possible.
Yep. I mean, good hay. Times I'll feed a lot of feed, and I've made a lot of money in a drought because I had a hay pile. And the nice thing about feed, it's kind of like the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. I give a calf 5-6 pounds of feed, and I know with nearly a 100% predictability what he's going to gain 1.5 pounds.
Right.
I mean, it costs more. My feed costs again maybe $1, and that's 70 cents on grass. But if it's worth $2, $1.80, who cares?
Right.
He's going to make 125 instead of 150.
Yep.
Now that being said, I mean, I never wanted to buy a grow yard or a feed yard. It's looked like it at times, but yeah, just you let them get used to each other and used to you. I mean, the biggest thing that Singer taught me was, that they view you predatorily. Mm-hmm. And we've all started, cut out a sick calf, and they wig out, they run through the water trough and freak out and run through a fence, and they'll run over you to get back in the bunch. All right, if that happens, you probably need to work on your stockmanship. And I've told people that, and it didn't make me real popular, And I said, he's out there. Well, who cares if you got to walk half of them to the lot? You're helping somebody and you're half a mile from the pens, and you cut a calf out and start taking him down the fence. You go 200 yards, and he starts trying to cut back. You're not going to get him to the pens without a nylon necktie. You just he's the smartest thing you do is put him down. And the guy said, he goes, well, I'm like, so what made you think putting these cattle half a mile from a pen was a good idea? Maybe if you put them on that pen up there close. And he said, well, I can turn them out here, and they got some grass, and there wasn't a lot of grass, but there was some. And I told him, yeah, but what's the cost of driving a sick one a half a mile the end of August? You've pretty well doomed him.
Yep.
So, I mean, just things like that, and drinking out of a mud hole pond that they're urinating and defecating in, but mostly, and I've got 2 sets of cattle out here now that first 2 weeks they were like feral pigs. I had a place that it was grown up a little, and these heifers weigh 230 pounds, and you go down there and pour out feed, and you can see them peeking around a bush like a doe second day of deer season. But they'll settle down, and it's like I taught my kids. It gets down to whether you're 6 inches too close or 6 inches too far away. And I said, and the 6 inches may be 50 feet from the calf, and it may be 200 yards. But you start heading towards them, and that's another thing. I've got a feed box, and I don't miss feed sacks or buckets like when I was a kid, but there's lots of cattle you can pull in there and circle around, run the feed trough. And if the cattle literally hear a door open, their radar comes up, and let alone you put a foot on the ground, they're gone. Mm-hmm. It's like, get out of the truck.
Right. A while back, you mentioned having some outside cattle around. What kind of grazing strategies were you using during this time, or do you use now?
Okay, it's two different things. I would like to think I'm a lot better. I was an early proponent. I live about 7 miles from the Noble Foundation. In the late 80s and the 90s, there was a guy named Charles Griffith there, who looking back was probably one of the pioneers of what is now known as regenerative ag. And we all thought he was crazy. And I know he thought that because I told him, well, this is nuts, Charles. Cattle won't eat weeds. He's like, we'll just put it, but I did early on. I saw the deal of it, and he was a good sport about it. It was like, yeah, this works, because a lot of that wheat I was telling you about, I would lease it by the acre. Most of the farmers wanted to leave it there, just put the same set of cattle there. And I finally started telling them, look, that's not making me money, because on up in the spring, get back to the value of the gain. I'm paying you 35 cents and that gain's worth 20. And I'm not going to suffer that. When by my figures, I'm breaking even with selling. And a lot of them, for reasons that I still don't, I mean, maybe they didn't understand what I did, but they got their default setting was, well, if you're swapping sets of cattle on me, I'm going to get screwed somehow. Well, let's just leave these here. And a lot of times I feel like, I probably fed more cattle on good wheat pasture. And a lot of people, why are you feeding that wheat's good? Well, it's December and I've got 2,000 pounds of cattle out there. My goal in those days was to kind of use the wheat pasture as a protein supplement. I mean, you could buy a cracked corn soy hull mix for $100 a ton. That sounds stupid now. 5 cents a pound. My feed cost of gain was less than the wheat. And you could, stack them up, and I would rotate graze, and it was about a 2 to 3 week rotation, and tweaked it. It's far most of the time when I do now, and there's not a lot of wheat left in this country, so I just kind of get my mind right. These cattle I bought now, I'll feed them a little bit until spring, and they may make enough money. From the looks of things, it's probably going to be hard for me to keep them, but I'm going to look at, I'll either sell them, in which case I've got about 350 acres of pretty good grass, but I try to do at least daily moves today. And I've kind of been, a lot of that stuff that Charles did, then he was like, you can put these cattle up tight enough they'll eat weeds. And I'm like, Charles, I'm going to make my cattle eat weeds. You make your cattle eat weeds, but my cattle are not going to eat weeds. And a sprayer full of 2,4-D was one of the last things I turned loose of. But it became obvious, you just get to looking, you wake up and look around, and it's like, well, what if we couldn't get all this stuff? And I said 2-3 years before, I had people calling me, man, they're hitting the panic button when urea got $1,200-$1,300 a ton. And I'm like, I don't know. Well, what are you going to do? And I'm like, same thing I did last year, not put any out.
Right.
I probably, along the lines of what I call a Knopfsinger's a hippie, I told Alan Williams one time he put on a seminar at the foundation, and my friend Hugh Aljo called me about 5:30 one morning. He said, why don't you come to school? I'm like, Hugh Joe, I got stuff to do, man. And my wife, who also works at the foundation, leaned over on the phone and she goes, he'll be there, Hugh. And so I was, Clay. I was sitting in that seat at 8 o'clock. And Alan Williams made that comment about meeting weeds, and he asked me what I thought of that. And I didn't learn my lesson with Knopfsinger in 2000. I told him. And then we went and did a graze, and he points out a 600-pound heifer eating a thistle. And once again, I'm like, man, the only common thread in here is me not being able to keep my mouth shut.
I was going to say it earlier. That's part of the benefits of being 6'6" and 230. You can say what you want, generally.
Yeah. But anyway, and then I started trying it, and they were the first people, I'm sure not the only people, that they what I call weaponized it. And that is, a lot of the early, in my opinion, the holistic stuff, it was more the craft or the trade. And it was like, so how y'all make money with this? Well, it's not about money. And I'm like, yeah, it is with me, and that's all right. I don't think there's any problem liking to make lots of money and worrying about meeting Jesus with a clear conscience. It's what you do with the money that gets you in trouble with Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, they kind of put it all together, and I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that. So you mentioned having cattle around now. Are there times you do sit out from buying?
I do. So with my job, I'm gone some, and my wife is usually here. So yeah, I kind of have to time it around that. And my guys at UA, I mean, if I call them and say, look, I'm fixing to buy some cattle, I'm gonna probably not. I don't want to be on the road for at least a month. And I've got a kid that I've kind of semi-trained, and another one he's just left. He graduated this year and he's gone. But I told my friend down the road. I said something. I had a surgery and can't lift a bucket, and told Bill, and he said Austin's 13, and I was like, well, I'm fixing to take him away from you because I'm pretty sure I'm gonna pay him quite a bit more than you are willing to, and so that may change if I had help, and I like what I'm doing now with understanding ag enough. You know, I don't want to quit what I did before, because I think that's part of the value that I brought to the company. Right. And I like doing it enough. I'm kind of, I guess like everybody else, I guess what Doc Holliday's saying, Tombstone, my hypocrisy knows no bounds. I want to keep being on the road and meeting people and consulting, but I keep wanting to run cattle. So yes, to answer your question, there is times now.
But it's not necessarily a price thing, right? I mean, because we're as high as we've been ever. I don't know if you figure inflation, maybe not, but we're really high right now, and you're still playing.
Yeah, and I'll tell you too, and this may raise some eyebrows. These calves are just now, up until 2-3 weeks ago, these calves were nearly for nothing. So I have a good friend in Western Oklahoma, and if I'm going to we figure stuff way different, and we both think the other one is ridiculous for the way that they do their math. But we're both right, and he is as good an operator as walks. And if I call him with a problem and some figures, and he calls me back in a day or two, and we have the same number, you can be 100% sure that it is right, because we arrived at it at two entirely different roads. So the way Brian looks at it, he'll look at the spread between what a calf costs and what he can sell him for. Take a 500-pound calf down in Oklahoma City, $280, but it's at $1,400. All right, May boards at say $270. That's on an 8-weight. That's nearly $2,200. So you've got $800 spread to play with. And I've started looking at it like that, but generally, and these numbers are kind of pre-pandemic. Before I would have said at $300 to $400 spread, all you're doing is kind of wearing your body and your equipment and your shoes on your horse out. You get around 4.5 or 5, I'll start playing, and you get over about 5.5, you're gonna make some good money. All right. There was spreads up until 3 weeks ago that were $1,000 or $1,100. I mean, I don't care what a calf cost, unless I think, boy, this thing could deflate. In 2015, there were some people bought some really high cattle, and they sold some really cheap cattle, and it wasn't fun for any of us. We all got a speeding ticket, and a few of us got our license took away.
Yeah, for sure. So I should really figure out what the actual percentage is around here, but it's very low, the number of uncut bull calves that you could go and buy in a 10,000 head sale. They're running 10,000 head of calves through in one day, and I don't know how many uncut bull calves you could get your hands on there that day. Not very many, and that's in all of the barns that I'm aware of in Western South Dakota. So I guess the reason I say that is I'm asking, what you're doing, or is what you're doing, will it work in other places around the country? Have you seen other places around the country where you think it'll work, or maybe it'll work everywhere?
I think it'll work probably to some degree everywhere. It may work better. Here you have a big, say you take McAllister tomorrow, they'll probably have 3,000 head, and they got 1,600 males. There may be 500 of them intact. And that's not a good reflection on Okies versus what one guy I worked for called you flatlanders, but we could. I know I've got a friend at Oklahoma State, Paul Beck, calls an intact bull the Oklahoma implant. And I tell him he's rude, but Paul is right. But yes, it will. I mean, there is something. There's going to be something that everybody wants, and there's going to be something that maybe not very many people do.
Right.
And it may change, and that's the big deal. It's got to be. I mean, you got to be adaptable, and a lot of people, it's like, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do, and it doesn't matter. We're going to do it until we can't do it anymore, or we're broke. And sometimes that works. And I realize the bigger you get, the more structure you have to have. Even when I was a lot bigger, it was a lot closer to guerrilla warfare than it was a frontal assault. I'm going to run around in the bushes and attack at night.
Yeah. You talk about the structure and some of those things. Is there a minimum set of facilities that you think is necessary to make something like this work? I always like to ask that question when I'm talking to stalker operators.
No, I've seen guys, pretty small and pretty rawhide that were good operators. And that kind of gets back to, if you got a bunch of panels, and boat art posts, take the telephone, you got to know your limits. You got to know what you're good at, and you got to know what you're not good at. And you got to know when to say, I just got to take a minute. Right.
Well, and I think that goes along too with how do you get started? Probably not by buying 3 loads of anything.
That's very well said.
How would you start? How would you get started? Or what are some things you would tell people to consider before they look at getting started?
I would probably tell them to attack slow. Just what you said, maybe, start slow and make sure that you take time to look around and say, man, is this work? Why did this not work? And for keep records, you don't have to have an Excel spreadsheet. I've seen some pretty big works of fiction written with an Excel spreadsheet. You don't have to have Word. You can do it with numbers, but one of my mentors, and he was one of the smartest people I met, went to school to the 5th grade. He would talk about your Big Chief tablet and your blankety blank crayons. Just write it down and figure. I'm still not a big computer fan. I still kind of I like writing it down. It's probably not an asset because there's probably a lot of things I could figure out with it, but you do not have to have a big spreadsheet. It's complex, but it's only complicated if we make it.
Right. Yeah, for sure. What does it mean to you to be disciplined in this business? And then how important is it to stay disciplined?
It's probably the difference between living and dying. Quite simply, that may not be enough of an answer for you, but.
Well, we've established how important it is. What is it?
The successful people I know, they are highly disciplined.
What do you mean by that? What is discipline in your mind? How do you define the term?
Meaning you get up and make sure you do the right thing every day. And with regards to buying, it's maybe knowing when to just go home with an empty trailer, or just tell your man, look, God bless you for quitting. Because a lot of people would say, well, they were really high, but I got you 20 more, but they're really high. Or maybe they're like, okay, well, I want 50 when knowing when to stop and when to go. And sometimes, and this has not always worked, but it usually does, Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner, I'll read just about anything he writes. And he made this statement one time. He said, we have a habit of wading off in the deep end when everybody else is headed for the beach. And there's a time to get after it. And
yep. And he's saying that's a key to their success, is being willing to wade into the deep end when everybody else is trying to get out.
They'll work, trust your numbers, having enough faith in your numbers if they're right. And if you're not collecting numbers and it's like, oh, I hope this works. Well, that's hope is a really good for your soul, but it's a horrible business plan. Horrible. I hope this works. And I've seen a lot of people bigger than me. Well, I hope this works. I'm like, man, you're airing out 300 grand and you use the word hope. On the other thing, and everybody fights this, and I'm not saying, well, for 20 years, it got to be a joke with the people. Normally, it's a $100 rule. When I could make $100, and the calf at that time was costing from 4 to 5. So maybe, like you said, we need to adjust it for inflation. And figured my cost of gain was around 75 to 90 cents a pound. I need some more of that, quite frankly. Just one more time, Clay. But it was like, okay, I've got the money made in these, and you're like, man, I sell these and we're going to have to go back to healing up cattle. What if I just kept them? I mean, being disciplined enough, I'm going to take a profit. I'm going to sell these, even though it'll be really easy and it might not make me a lot of money, or I'll just keep these and turn them out on the grass, and maybe being willing to go to work when you don't want to, and knowing when and how to go to work. That's a little bit of an abstract answer, but
sure. No, I appreciate
one of my mentors told me one time, he said, there's two big things that'll kill you in this business. And I'm like, what's that? And he said, one's not sticking with your plan. You got to stick with your plan, Slim. And I'm like, what's the other one? And he looked me straight face, didn't laugh. And he goes, sticking with it too long. That can kill you. And I'm like, how am I supposed to know the difference, Jack? And he goes, you'll sort it out. In about 10 years, I told him I got it sorted out. And he said, I thought you would. You're a smart boy.
Yeah. The only problem with learning when sticking with your plan too long is usually it's expensive, but
yep. Tuition bill.
Yep.
And, I think a lot of guys, and I don't know about in your country, and I realize a lot of people, I talk a lot about with the people I visit about stocking at capacity. And I understand very quickly, whether they know it or not, they will start using verbiage that is, and I will tell you, most of the places I go, people are overstocked. Other than not cutting a bull calf, Okies are really good at overgrazing. We can do it better than anybody. And for years, cheap hay would bail you out. And I think cheap hay is, I think the only person with a pile of cheap hay left is Easter Bunny and Bigfoot. And I can't find them. But, tell them, maybe what if you didn't run quite as many cows, and they get into cash flow. They may not use that word, but you can see it's like, oh my God, if I sell 50 cows and that's going to be 40 or 45 more less calves I got it. I ain't going to be able to make my payments. Right? The problem is not the cows, and you're not going to fix it overstocking. The problem is you got too much stuff that takes diesel and has pneumatic tires. That's the usual culprits. But y'all would say maybe, and I kind of just thought of this, somebody want to get started, maybe start with your calf crop. Because I'll tell people too, if you're a cow-calf guy, the second you separate that calf from his mother, you are a stocker operator. And if you don't understand that right between your ears, you need to get rid of them just as fast as you can. I mean, by and large, and I say this loosely, a cattle operation, the less you spend, the more you'll make. And that's true in the stocker deal too, but quite often, maybe I'll get $50 worth of feed will make me $100 worth of calf. Well, that's a 2-for-1 return. 2 months. That's a pretty good deal. Beats Wall Street. It's a 200% annualized return on investment. I think a lot of people, man, how do I want to say this without repeating? Maybe out of the room, keep your calves.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You may do it and think, I hate this. I'm never doing this again. And you may think, I told the guy some years ago, I'm like, just keep your calves. That's the easiest way to start, probably the least expensive, or keep some of them. And I was by there a couple of years, and there's like 300 yearlings out there. And I'm like, dude, what'd you do with your cow? He goes, I hate those cows. This is great. Thank you so much. And some people are like, no, this is it. I hate you, Kent. You made me do this.
Yeah. It comes down to what do you want to do, right? What are you good at, like you said? Yep. Yeah, you talk about the triangle, right? Very few places have gone broke having too much grass and too much money in the bank. Lots of places have gone broke having too many cows.
I think is that a Bud Williams quote?
Yeah, it is. Yep.
Yeah, and that's, when I got started in the yearling deal, I mean, it was a period slower motion, but kind of like now, we were at the bottom of the cattle cycle coming up, and all you really had to do is own one and keep him alive. And this guy I was working for probably got taught me more than anybody, a guy named John Mayer. He, I'd buy a set of calves, and I'd never done it before. Close, I got to start off raising bucket calves. Well, when you're raising bucket calves at 250 pounders, it's no big deal. But you buy them, something like, man, I'm making money. And John would tell me, he would put his hand on my shoulder and say, son, it's not always like this. And that was back into what another friend I have refers to as the 90s, when it rained when it was supposed to. We didn't really have a dry year. I got started in 88 and it's like, wow, market didn't really went down some in 92, but it was okay. And it rocked along 96 and corn went from $3 to $6 and fats went from 80 cents to 50 cents and feeder cattle went from 90 cents to 40. And then it didn't rain. It didn't have no wheat. And I went and hunted John up and I was hunting a little sympathy, which I didn't get. And I said, is this what you were talking about? And he said, yeah. And I said, man, this is not fun. And he said, well, he goes, I think it was Nietzsche that said that does not destroy you will make you stronger. And it nearly destroyed me, but it didn't. And I was stronger. And I listened to those old men after that.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned quite a few times that the best help you had the last name Donica and all that. Can you talk about the ins and outs or some of the things that you enjoyed or some of the things you learned from working with family and training your kids and some of those things?
So, when I was growing up, we kind of got, well, let's just say my dad and uncle didn't have a real high bar for employment with Donica Brothers Brangus. If you kind of showed up, they figured you were going to dog it if they weren't around. So they kind of paid you accordingly, and they paid us accordingly, which none of us liked. So most of us didn't stick around. And I told my kids that story, and I said, look, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pay you like a slot machine, but I'm probably going to be the meanest boss you ever have. And I made it a point. I didn't mind working them. It's like another guy told me one time, he said, you can't kill them. He said, you'll want to, but you can't. And he said, you can't work them hard enough. And I told them, well, I got a lot of cliches. And one of them, they're like, man, this is not fun. Wow, this is not fun. I'm like, well, that's why you get a check, because it ain't fun enough to do for free. Shut up. And when my youngest was the only one left, she decided she wanted a raise. And she wanted what her brother had making, and he's 10 years older. And I said, Claire, you understand, we weren't sitting around the house at 3:00 on Thursday afternoon. And I said, she's like, did Samuel really make $1,500 a month? And I said, yeah, and he's probably worth 18. I didn't ever tell him that. And she goes, I need a raise. I'm like, why don't you call your siblings and say that? So my oldest daughter is in medical school at the time, and she tells her, well, Clary, until I had a degree in biochemistry, Donica Livestock was the best job I ever had. You need to shut up. Well, she didn't like that. So she calls the one that's at Oklahoma State. And Savannah tells her, look, I'm cleaning up other people's dirty dishes for $7 an hour, and you're making $12. You need to shut your mouth. And they both called and told me that, Clay. And so when Clary comes home the next day, I was like, what'd you say to Maddie and Savannah? I said, what they say? Oh, not much, Dad. I guess I'm good with 12. And I didn't tell her for several years that I knew what they had said. But
all of a sudden, I don't want to talk about it anymore.
We're good. We're solid, Dad. That's what she goes. We're solid, Dad. I think I'm good with 12. And I let it slide. But, I never did overload them. I would load them. But I explained everything. And, that, when I was a kid, too, something about this. And, it was kind of because I said so, damn it. And, man, that crawled all over me. And I never did that with my kids. I would sit down and explain it. But if they knew what to do, I'm like, this is it. And all of them, they worked a summer or two off. And, get to be teenagers. Your old man's stupid. I want to go work town. And I was like, okay, because I'll usually miss them more than I did when they started the town. And they were usually happier to come back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very
then
good.
We'd take a day off, it was like, when we work, we work, and when we play, we play.
Yep.
They used to talk about in high school, when Samuel got his daughter, they'd talk about, man, we're tired. Well, we get up early and we come in at noon, and all of a sudden we had some friends that put in a swimming pool, and all of a sudden, well, we're going to go over to the Whites and go swimming. I said, I thought y'all was too exhausted to work before lunch. Oh, Dad, let's see, we'll wake you up when we get home. and a lot of people, it was, we had bumps in the road, and a lot of that I'll credit my wife. I don't take instruction well at all. My default setting is don't tell me what to do and be quiet. And she didn't suffer either one of those well. She like, maybe if you did this, y'all. And she grew up on a big ranch too, so she had experience working under her dad. And
sure.
But mostly they saw the stuff I had. I mean, they already learned early on, look, this is important. It was, we got to go check these calves or they're going to die. It doesn't matter if it's raining. Put your muck boots on and a raincoat. We got to go feed.
Right. Yep. And it'll be less fun later if we don't do it now.
Yeah.
When they do go the wrong direction.
Yeah. I couldn't say one night and got up the next morning, went out there. So I never liked a lot of dads, but you go to run. It's like I told the guys. So you go to run in the tack up in the yellow. Don't whine when you blow an engine. Rod comes through the hood. It ain't nobody's fault but yours. All wounds are self-inflicted. So I go out there. I'm out there looking around. The kids went to school, and you tell the skid marks where they drug this dead calf up from a trap into the sick pen. And so, like, I followed the track back out. Well, he was a pin dead, and they knew a pin dead did freak the old man out. Why did the calf die? Not in the sick pen. And so they get home. I'm like, what about that calf out there in the sick pen? Oh, I don't know, Dad. And I'm like, well, I can tell y'all this. Next time y'all drag one in there so you don't get your butt chewed out, maybe you take a set of cattle and run stomp all the tracks out. Oh, man, you saw? I'm like, yeah, I saw that, guys.
Yep. I really appreciate your time today. It's been fantastic. You mentioned a couple of times a course you're putting together. Where can people learn more, or do you have a timeline on when that might come together or what that looks like?
I think the first one is in Kansas City, the end of November. I don't know if they're up on Understanding Ag's website or not, but they will be. If they're not, they will be shortly. I think we've got one the end of November, Kansas City, the end of January in Dallas, and I think one in February in Atlanta, I believe. But they should be posted on the UA website. If they're not, and we're still in the heavy planning on it. And it's kind of, I guess like this, it's like, okay, we're going to try to make it pretty intense 2 days, things that you can go home. And I'm glad that you mentioned that value of gain, because I told the crew, look, I want an hour on that. I mean, I've told people for years that value of gain, that is what you live and die by. And they're like, well, I probably not me. I don't know what it is. And my pat answer is, yeah, it is. Whether you know it or not is irrelevant. That's what's right. And I mean, that was the big deal. You get to figure, and maybe it's not a lot, but you got 500 head turned out and it's $20. Well, that's 10 grand. It's like, okay, this is worth 50 cents and it's costing me 75 to put it on. Well, at that point, it didn't really matter. I mean, I would sell cattle for way less than 100 because they very quickly, maybe they weren't there yet. They may make 50 now, and you keep them 2 months, they may break even. And if you summer them, now that can change and it's fluid. But if that persists, maybe when you sell them, you think, I just got handed 50, and it's like, those things have made $50. And I was in partners with one of my brother-in-laws one time, and that deal got bad, and it got bad fast. And it was getting to the point where we were going to have trouble covering our bet. And I figured out a way to get out, and I called him, and he said something that I have told lots of people, and I still think, and he goes, listen, Donica, I'm not near as greedy as I was day before yesterday, and 0 is a really cool number. And I think in this business that sometimes you can do everything right, and you just sometimes the bear is just going to come out of the cage and beat you. Mm-hmm. And you got to recognize, kind of like getting back to the plan, and sometimes 0 is a cool number. I don't like it, but it can be cool, and I still not like it.
Right. Yep. It's every day you don't sell cattle is a day you bought cattle.
Yep. I may have you as a guest lecturer that's also a hard concept. If you own it, if they're too high to buy, they're probably too high to keep.
Right.
Yep. I was selling a bunch off of wheat one year, and these cattle making $200 when 75 of them cattle were cheap. I mean, I give like $1. I had a payment, and I had about 400 head on this place, and the pens would just barely hold a load. I mean, if you had to sort them horseback, because you got in there and got the chute backed up, that's it. 2 pens. Not the safest place in the world. Well, I needed some money. Well, there's 8 or 10 of them standing in the lodge. I run there, shut the gate, haul them to the city, and they bring like $1.40 a pound. I called customer and I said, "You got the scale tickets mixed up. My cattle worth about $1.15, Bob." And he goes, "That's what I told them." I get to thinking about all the money I'm like, "Thanks, Bob," again. Well, I started figuring out how much money I had. And it was a lot. It was enough that it scared me. And so we started selling them. And I had a neighbor that he got really irate. And I told him, I was like, "Look, if you think I'm screwing up, buy them." "Oh my God, you can't afford these things." And I told him that. And then I asked him, and he got mad and left. And I said, "Look, if you kept a calf," and this was like late February, and while they were hunting his grass cattle, and I said, "If you kept your cattle until the 10th of June, and the week after you ate the last bite of headed ryegrass, and your cattle made $100, would it be a good year?" "Well, yeah." And I said, "So if I can sell mine the 3rd day of March, and they make 200, how is that a bad year?" He gets mad and leaves. He said, "Oh, you're just twisting stuff around." I'm like, "You're right. I am. I'm so sorry.
I'm doubling the money in half the time. Sorry."
Exactly. But yeah, you buy into it, and that's what I heard another guy at the sale. And I've had people ask me, "Man, why'd you hang out at this sale? You're so smart." And I'm like, "Well, here's the deal. Statistically, nobody at the sale is under the bell curve. Everybody's an outlier. Some of the crookedest, sorriest people I ever met, sitting at Sale Barn Cafe, and some of the finest people, a lot of the finest people I ever met." And I told this guy, I said, "Look, there's a couple $1 million a week passes through the sale barn at McAllister. It is pretty foolish to think there's not going to be some information." And it's always funny, if I was working in the ring, somebody sitting there, somebody knew 2/3 of the people come up there like, "These things are high." And then some of them like, I had a guy come up to me and goes, "How long?" He goes, "How long are you going to be here?" And I was like, "I'll eat breakfast in the cafe." And he goes, Okay. And he goes, "I'm going to be back in about 3 hours with some calves." He goes, "I didn't have any idea these things is this high." And I'm like, "All right, you and me can be friends." And he went home and filled up a 28-foot gooseneck and brought it back to me.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yes, Kent, fantastic stuff. I really appreciate your time today, and we'll track down that link for the school that you got coming up, and we'll put it in the show notes page if we can find it. So appreciate it.
Outstanding. Well, I hope I answered most of your questions, and other than telling you a bunch of wild stories from Oklahoma, but you covered it. You said it. It's selling get a money made, sell them. And if you know your costs, and I think a lot of people don't do that more, Clay, is they don't know what their cost is. Yep. For years, somebody called me, "Yeah, you think it's how to sell my cattle?" And I ask them, what do you take to get out with your hair? What's your break even? And most of them will start with "well," or or "I think," or "around," which means they don't have a clue. And so if they eat everybody grass and sell them, well, there's really nothing else you could have done. So we did the best we could. And if we lose money, we just got to wait and hope we do better next year.
Yeah. I think it comes down to the fact that a lot of people like having cows and green paint around. And if they can break even doing that, slowly go broke doing that, they're happy, honestly.
And I think a lot of it kind of gets to the change. Inertia is far more dangerous than change. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people, they just want to keep it just like they're comfortable. They don't want to get out of their comfort zone. And I never like spending too much time in mine, which probably means I'm twisted, not braided.
All right, Ken, thank you so much. Very much appreciate your time today.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It was a pleasure. I had a lot of fun.
Very good stuff there with Kent. Really appreciate his perspective and his way of articulating things, and appreciate all the wisdom that he shared. Made another rookie podcaster mistake and left my recorder at home when I went to give a talk at the Sturgis, South Dakota Chamber of Commerce Ag Appreciation Banquet, so won't have that to share with you. Had to reschedule some other things. What I think we're going to do is have a conversation with Enrique Guerrero, welcome him back to the podcast. He has done some amazing things with mine regeneration, taking cattle to mine lands and regenerating them. So we're going to get an update on that project, but also talk to him a little bit about some amazing work that he has been a part of on another ranch in Texas.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.